Hey guys, how's it going? It's Jay, and in this video I have the Sony A6700, and what we're going to go over is autofocus settings for both photo and video. I'm going to cover everything you need to know in this video, so let's just get right into it. Alright guys, so looking at the Sony A6700 here, I'm just going to flip it up and I'm going to turn this beast on, like so. And notice how I have it in photo mode right here. All right guys, so we're gonna go over photo mode first. So I'm gonna show you all the different autofocus settings in regards to photography. Then we're gonna go over, and I'm gonna switch the camera to video mode, and we're gonna go over all the autofocus settings in regards to video mode. Then I'm gonna go into the lab scene, and I'm gonna show you how this stuff works in the lab scene so you can actually visualize it. And I'll go through the settings like again in the lab, so it'll like put the pieces together. So again, first we're gonna go through it like here looking down at the camera and everything, then we'll go into the lab and like reinforce everything that we just went over. All right guys, so the Sony A6700 has two like main modes, I guess you would call it. So we have autofocus mode and then we have autofocus area. So those are like the two things that kind of dictate how autofocus is going to behave. So for example, if I go into the function menu, by the way, I just initialized the Sony A6700. So this is what it should look like on a brand new camera. So I didn't change any settings. This is out of the box. So anyways, right here, see where it says focus mode? So if we click on focus mode, these are all the different focus modes. Now you have autofocus AFS, it stands for, okay? Now that stands for single shot autofocus. Now if you hit the little garbage can here on the side, it'll explain what that does. Press the shutter button to lock focus when shooting still subjects. So what autofocus single shot does is when you hit the shutter button, it'll actually figure out what to focus on based on some of the other camera settings you have set, and it'll like lock when you hold the shutter button down halfway. Then you can actually recompose your shot if you want, and the autofocus isn't going to change. When you press the shutter button all the way, it'll take the photo. That's what autofocus S stands for, single shot AF. Now, automatic AF, again, you can hit the garbage can and it'll tell you. So the automatic AF will automatically switch between autofocus single shot and autofocus continuous. Now, autofocus continuous is for when you're tracking moving subjects. Continuous focusing while shutter button is halfway down for moving subjects. So in AFC mode, if you hold the autofocus or the shutter button down halfway, you'll see like little dots dancing around. That's autofocus continuous. So it is constantly looking for something to focus on. So if subjects move in the scene, it'll just track them automatically. I'll show you that in the lab in a minute so you can see it with your own eyes, don't worry. But that's what AFC does. Now, direct manual focus. So what direct manual focus does, DMF, is it basically uses autofocus, but when you hold the shutter button down and you lock the autofocus, like it'll be like locked on a subject, you could then press the focus ring on the lens and fine tune the autofocus. Then when you press the shutter the rest of the way, it'll take the shot as to where you fine tuned it. That's what DMF does. I'll show you that in the lab in a minute and it'll make a little bit more sense. All right, so that's what DMF does. Now, MF is manual focus. So that will just put the camera in manual focus mode and you will have to turn the lens focus ring to adjust the focus. That's the only way to adjust it in manual focus mode. So I'm just gonna click OK. I'm gonna go back to AFS here. Click OK. Now, if we hit the function menu, I just want to show you a couple of other things in here. All right, so right here we have focus area. Now, if we go into focus area, you have a bunch of different modes for focus area. Now, how you need to think about focus area is basically how much of the screen the camera is going to use to focus on. So you could look at it like the sensor or the screen. So basically autofocus area limits the focus to like certain parts of the screen. So wide mode, you're pretty much using the entire screen. Now when you go down to zone mode, for example, you could see how it comes up with these 9 boxes. Now you can actually move these boxes around a little bit to limit the focus to that zone or that area, right? Because we're in focus area mode. And I'll just put it back in the center. Now, another thing to keep in mind here, notice how it says select focus point on off. Notice how when I press the button here, it's turning the focus points on and off. So if you have it on, it'll allow you to move it around like so. If you have it off, it looks like this, and now you can't move it around. So that's what that little circle there with select focus point on off means. All right. So now if we go back into the function menu here, we can change the area to center fix. Now it's just in the center and you can't move it. So you can see that little box, that is center fix. This is great if you're tracking moving subjects or if you just want the focus limited to the center of the frame. For example, if you're trying to focus on a flower and it keeps focusing on the background or whatever, you can put it on center here. It'll really limit the focus to just that one little spot and it'll make it a little bit easier in a lot of situations. Now you can also go to focus area spot. Now this one will allow you to move it around and you can change the size. You see how it has the little arrows next to it? That's how you know you can change the size of it. And you have a large, medium, and a small. So if I go to small, you could see just how small that focus point is. And now I could move the focus point around like so. And don't forget, guys, I didn't mention it yet, but this is also a touch camera. So you can touch and it'll move that focus point around. So your touch focus area will change with this area mode. So if I go back into function menu, all right, guys, so focus area spot and focus area expand spot will move around if you use touch to focus. So it will move around for you. And notice again how we have this select focus point on off. And if I select it, you can see how the arrows come up. You see that? The little arrows come up on the focus area. So now I could move this around using the directional pad. Now if I hit this again, the arrows go away. And if I use the directional pad, it's now going to open up the ISO because that's what the item is for the menu item here when I click it. So if I go back here and set that again, now the arrows are back. Now look, see I could move it again. So that's what those little arrows do, and that's what that focus on means. However, you could just touch around, guys, and it'll still move. So you can always override it with touch if you have touch enabled. Now notice this last option here, it's grayed out, so it won't let me select it, and that's because I'm in focus area single shot. So if I go into the function menu here, and I change this to continuous, now I'm on continuous autofocus, go back to function. Now if I go to focus area, see this? Tracking. So this particular focus area is optimized for tracking purposes. That's why the camera wants to be in autofocus continuous mode, because continuous mode, remember, is made for tracking moving subjects. This is where the focus dots will dance around because it's constantly trying to find what to focus on continuously. So if you want to change your area here in optimized for tracking, this is where you would go. And you pretty much have all the different focus areas in this tracking mode. So if you only want to track, you can set the focus area to these different tracking modes. And that's what this is for. This is pretty cool. So I'm just going to go back up and put it in wide focus area. All right, guys, so you see this menu item right here? This is called touch focus. And so what that's going to do is when you touch here, it's only going to focus on the area that I'm selecting. That's what that means. Now, if I go into function here and I select that item, I can change it to touch tracking. Now, when I touch, it's going to track. Now, you're not seeing the box come up because there's nothing to see. So if I switch to this mode here real quick. All right, so now if I touch, it's going to track whatever I touch on. So if I touch like right there, you see that little white box that just came up? That's touch tracking. And if I move the camera, it's still going to continue to track what I touched on. So I know it's a little hard to see. I'll show you this better in the lab in a moment. But that's what touch function in shooting does. So you can set it to focus or tracking. Now, this isn't autofocus related, but you can also change this to touch shutter. So when you have this selected, if you just touch the screen, it will focus and take the photo. That's what touch shutter is. You also have touch auto exposure. So if you have it set to that, wherever you touch, the camera will then prioritize that area for auto exposure. And then you can actually turn touch off here. If you don't want to use touch, this is where you can go to turn it off. So I'm just going to put that back to touch focus for now. All right, so now back into the function menu. Now we have another item here we need to talk about, and that is called recognition target and subject recognition on and off. So if you want the camera to prioritize subjects, This is where you would go to turn that on and off. Now, I usually leave this on. Sometimes, though, you might want to turn it off if it keeps focusing on a subject that you don't want it to focus on. For example, if I have one of my kids in the scene and they're holding up a leaf and I want the camera to focus on the leaf, I have to turn subject detect off because it's going to focus on their face if I have human subject detect on. So I don't want the camera to focus on the face. Therefore, in that scenario, right, I would turn this off. So I would turn subject detect off, and then the camera will prioritize basically whatever's closest to the camera, depending on the focus area. Remember, because it's going to limit to the area that I have. But if I had wide area selected, by default, the camera's going to focus on whatever's closest to the camera. So that's what that feature does. Now, if I turn that back on here, go back into function, and if you go to recognition target, here's all the different recognition target options you have. Now, the A6700 is the latest and greatest, so it has animal, bird, has just animal, has just bird. So I really like how it has that combined for when you're out and doing wildlife stuff. And then, of course, you have insects, which is great for bees and stuff like that. And then you have cars and trains, and then you have airplanes. So up here is human. I'm just going to put it back to human. And that is the basics of the autofocus modes, but there's more options in the menu. So if I go into the menu here and I go over, notice here on the left on the purple icon, it says autofocus, manual focus. This is the autofocus area settings basically for focus. So these are the different options. So we already went over this. This is continuous autofocus. So here are the different options. Single shot, automatic, continuous, manual, so forth, just like you saw a minute ago in the function menu. Now here we have set priority in AFS. So what this means is if you actually go up here and hit the garbage can, it'll explain. So the shutter will not open when not in focus, for when you want to be sure you are in focus. So when you have AF set, the camera won't take the photo unless the focus is locked. Like sometimes the focus might be struggling. The camera won't take the photo if you have it set to AF. If you have it set to release and the camera is struggling to focus, it will still take the shot because now the priority is set to getting the shot, whether it's sharp or not. And balanced emphasis is in between the two. So most of the time it'll take the photo when the focus is locked on, but not all the time necessarily. So I recommend leaving it on balanced, but that's what this feature does. And it has this option as well for AFC for when you're continuously autofocusing. So again, I recommend leaving it on balanced, but you can change that. And it's cool that you have that kind of power in this camera. Now, AF tracking sensitivity, responsive. Again, if you hit the garbage can, it'll tell you what this stuff means. Sets the AF subject tracking sensitivity to 5. Autofocus cycles through subjects at different distances consecutively. So if you're doing like field sports and there's like 5 kids running out there or 5 people playing soccer and you keep focusing, the camera's going to pick different subjects like as you keep resetting the focus. If you have it set to 1, for example, and I hit the garbage can, continue focus on the subject even when it's out of the focus area. So this is basically locked on, as you could see. So when I focus and hold it down, it's going to be locked on to whatever subject I focus on. Now, if that subject leaves the frame for a second and comes back in, the camera is still going to remember. So locked on is awesome for when your subject maybe goes behind a tree for a second or something like that. Or if there's other players in the field and you don't want it to focus on one as you're tracking one subject, that's what locked on is for. And same thing, if you're trying to track like a dog running towards you or something like that, and there's other things in the scene, other dogs, the camera might switch to the other dog. So locked on will make sure it stays on the subject that it's locked onto. By default, normally I like to have it set to standard mode. Now you also have aperture drive in AF. Now the aperture diaphragm, depending on what mode you're in, can change, and that will basically change your aperture, which will control depth of field and things like that, depending on what you're doing. And what the camera can actually do is, if you set it to focus priority, it really won't care how much noise the aperture mechanism makes, because the aperture opening and closing makes a little bit of noise. Focus priority will allow the aperture to do whatever it needs to do to try to get the subject in focus as much as possible without worrying about the noise and stuff. Now, silent priority will make sure that the aperture isn't going like moving around and stuff like that, and you might not have as accurate autofocus depending on what you're doing and what mode you're in, but it's kind of cool that it gives you this feature. Autofocus with shutter. This just means when you press the shutter button down halfway, it's going to autofocus. That's what that means. So you can turn that on and off if you want. Now, full-time DMF. Remember what direct manual focus is. That's basically autofocus, but then you can fine-tune it. Once the focus is locked, you can fine-tune it with the manual focus ring on the lens. So you can actually make this full-time, put the camera like that if you want. Pretty cool feature. I really like that. I'm actually going to turn that on. Now, pre-AF. What pre-AF means is, again, you can hit the garbage can if you want more information on these subjects. It sets whether or not to perform autofocus when you do not have the shutter pressed. So if you're just walking around like aiming the camera will pre-focus for you on what it thinks it needs to focus on without you pressing the shutter button. That's what pre-AF does. It's a pretty cool feature. You may or may not want that. It will chew up a little bit of battery life if you're just sitting there, because the camera's always going to be focusing and stuff. But it's a pretty cool feature, and it might get you focused faster on a subject if you have this enabled. So it's up to you whether you want to enable it or not, but that's what that does. Now, here's a couple more focus options. You got focus area limit. You can go in here and you can uncheck these options if you don't want them to show up in the focus area settings options. Remember how when we were in focus area before, we were scrolling through and there was all these different settings? So you can uncheck them if there's some that you just don't want to use. That's what that area is. Let's hit menu to go back. All right, so switch vertical horizontal AF area. This basically refers to if you turn the camera like vertical like this, will the autofocus points change? So you can turn that on or off depending on your preference. Now you can change the autofocus area color. White is default, but you can change it to red if you want. AF area registration. This is kind of an advanced feature, but you can register an area and then you can have it custom programmed to a custom button. And then when you press that button, the camera will just go to that area. That's what that feature is. Pretty cool. And this is where you would delete that registered area. AF auto clear. This will just make it auto clear after you take the photo if you want that feature. Again, you can hit the question mark and it'll tell you what it'll do. Now, if we go down, area display during tracking, I'm actually going to turn this on, and this will just help you see better what the autofocus system is doing while you're taking photos. AFC area display, that's on. Phase detect area, that will show like all the different phase detection autofocus points. So I'm going to leave that off because it's almost too much on the screen. And circle, do not circulate. I'm not going to worry about that. Auto framing, this is the auto framing feature where it'll actually track you like a cameraman. This is where you can change the amount of movement of the auto framing. Now, subject recognition, this is where the options are. You already saw this in the function menu, but you can turn it on and off here, and you have even more power. This is where you can go and select the options that you want to recognize, so you can limit that if you want. And then if you go down here, this is where you can select which eye you want to prioritize. By default, it's on auto. Now, subject framing display, you can turn that on or off. I'm actually going to turn that on, and it'll show like a box around the subject that you're currently framing. Face memory, this is where you can go and you can program faces. So in here, you could have faces programmed in there and then set a priority to that face so the camera will prioritize specific faces. Incredible power. Auto magnifier in manual focus, I have that turned on. And when you're in manual focus, if you turn the focus ring, it'll automatically zoom in for you. It'll automatically magnify so you can see and fine tune the focus a little bit better. And this is just the time limit for that. So you can have that limited if you want, or have it set to no limit. This is autofocus while in autofocus magnify. That's a pretty cool feature. I have that turned on. And now here you have peaking levels. Peaking is basically a tool that will overlay color onto high contrast areas, which will help you find sharpness. So when you have peaking enabled, I'll show you in the lab. When you have peaking enabled and you turn the focus ring, you'll actually see like color light up on where the focus is. That's what peaking does. You can change the amount of power that the peaking has, so like the size of it, and also the color depending on what subject you're shooting. So you might want to change that color. As you can see here, there's all these different colors. All right, so one other thing while we're in photography mode, what I wanted to show you guys is this button right here. There's also buttons to get to this stuff as opposed to the function menu, but if you hit this button here on the left-hand side, this will bring you into drive mode. Now, this isn't really autofocus related, but it kind of is, because if you're tracking moving subjects, whether you want to take one shot or if you want to take consecutive shots, like if you're tracking a moving subject, you're going to want to have consecutive shots enabled most likely. This is where you would go to do that, drive mode. Right now it's in single shooting. So what that means is it'll just take one shot when you take the photo. If you go down to high speed continuous shooting, that will take multiple shots. I'll show you this in the lab as well. Now you also have self timer. So you can set the self timer and notice the little arrows. That means you can go left and right and you can see the numbers on the bottom. So you can set the self timer to 5 seconds, 2 seconds, whatever. Then you have drive mode, self timer continuous. This is great if you want to take multiple photos with self timer. Excellent for family portraits and stuff like that because someone always has their eyes closed, you know what I mean? And then you have continuous bracketing. This is advanced for like HDR photography and stuff like that. And you got bracketing single mode. Focus bracketing. This is incredible that the camera has this. This will allow you to take up to 299 shots for focus bracketing. So this is really, really powerful for macro photography where you have to stack images due to limited depth of field and stuff like that. You also have bracketing for white balance and bracketing for dynamic range optimizer. So that is the one other feature I wanted to show you in photography mode that's kind of related. And again, the high speed shooting mode, guys, you can change that here. You got high speed, medium, low, and extra high here. So this will give you that 10 frames, 11 frames per second when you have it set to this mode. And that is pretty much all the settings for autofocus. So let me go into video mode here and show you the different settings in video mode. So now if I hit function here, we have focus area. So you can see here in focus mode, we only have autofocus continuous and manual focus. That's it for video. So, which makes sense. You're recording video, you kind of need it in continuous or manual. There's no single shot for video because it's constantly recording, you know what I mean? Now you have the facial recognition. Again, you can turn that subject detect on or off, and you can pick your subject as well. And you can also have touch to focus and touch to track. So you can see you have those two features. You don't have touch shutter because remember we're recording video, but you do have auto exposure for touch, or you can turn touch off. So those are all available in video as well. And then, like I said, you have focus area. So if you go in here, you have all the different focus areas, but notice how that bottom one for the tracking isn't an option here in video mode. But you can track in video mode. If you go to the function menu here, you still have the tracking option. So it is still there. So that does still work, just so you know. And now, if I go into the menu here, we already covered most of this in photo mode, so this will be much quicker. But in video mode, again, you have focus mode, but this is the key difference in video mode. You have autofocus transition speed. So if you're recording video and you focus on something in the background and then you switch to something in the foreground, autofocus transition speed will basically dictate how long that will take to go from one focus point to another focus point. Now, if you want a cinematic look, you would want a slower focus transition, right? In theory, not necessarily, but I'm just saying as an example. Now, if you're trying to track a moving subject while recording video, you don't really want it slow. You're going to want it a little bit faster. You know what I'm saying? So it just depends on what you're doing. So autofocus transition speed by default is set to 5. So I tend to put it around 4, but it really depends on what you're doing. If you're filming humans, you might want to have it at like 5 or 6 if they're like moving in front of you kind of quickly. If you want it a little bit softer and not jerky, you might want to slow the transition speed down a little bit. That's what that does. Now, AF subject shift sensitivity, so responsive. So again, you can hit the garbage can if you want more information, and this is the same as photography mode. If you have it set to responsive, it's going to be way more likely to switch subjects when recording. Now, if you have it set to locked on, it's going to be way less likely to switch subjects. And if your subject goes out of the frame for a minute, the camera's going to remember that and like wait for them. And when they come back into frame, it'll just pick right up where it left off. So locked on is a really powerful feature. So by default, right around 3 Seems to work pretty good. Now, AF Assist. Again, if you hit the garbage can here. All right, guys, so AF Assist. Think of the direct manual focus mode. Remember how if you just turn the focus ring, when you have the autofocus locked, it will adjust the focus for you? Like DMF, that's what the direct manual focus does. AF Assist does the same thing in video mode, basically. So if you turn the focus ring while in video mode, the focus will change and the camera will automatically lock on to wherever the focus is changing to. So if you had two subjects at different distances, I'll show you this in the lab. If you have two subjects at different distances and the camera just won't focus on the subject you want, you can actually fine tune it by turning the manual focus ring to get it to focus on the other subject. You could also just touch the screen on the other subject also, and then it'll switch to focusing on that area or tracking that subject. It depends. There's multiple ways to like do this stuff, but that's what AF Assist is. So I'm actually going to turn that on like so. Now, if we go down here, we have same settings as photo. You got focus area limit, focus area color, autofocus frame movement amount, that's set to standard. Subject recognition and all of this stuff is pretty much the same. Human, right eye, left eye, face memory, all that stuff's the same. Focus map is the other feature I wanted to show you. Focus map kind of works similar to focus peaking. I'll show you this in the lab. So focus map basically overlays a bunch of colors, and where it's like clear, like where you can see the subject that you're filming, that is in focus. So it's like another focusing tool, basically. Focusing assistant is what Sony calls it. And then of course focus magnifier we have. So you can turn that on right there. Menu, no limit, peaking display. Again, we already went over that. So those are all the different autofocus settings for photo and video. Now let me go in the lab here and I'll show you how this stuff works in like a kind of real world simulation over here, right? Let's go. All right, guys, so now I have the camera set up in the lab scene, and just for reference, I am using the Sony E16 to 55mm f2.8 G lens, and I have it at 55mm right now. So I'm just zoomed in there. So if we go into the function menu here, let me just show you the settings, how it's set right now. I have it set to facial subject detection is turned on. It's set to humans, and I have it set to autofocus mode single shot. Now if I go to drive mode, I also have it, on drive mode I have it on continuous high. So let me put it on single first and show you how that works. So now I'm pressing the shutter button down halfway. You can see my finger here? Just pressing it halfway. If I press it all the way, it takes the photo. And notice how it just took one photo. Now if I go into drive mode again and switch this to high speed and I go to take a photo, hear that? Now it's going to limit the amount of photos it can take per second depending on how fast the shutter speed is. So if right now the shutter speed is at 1/100th of a second, so that's as fast as it's going to go. However, if I change the ISO and I max it out, let's say, put it at like 25,000, now listen. So that's as fast as it can go. And it, like I said, it depends on shutter speed, just in case you guys were not aware. Now you can also slow that down, like you can use mid. Let me just change my ISO back here. Put that back on auto, like so. So that's continuous slow. Great. Now that's a great feature if you're just doing portraits or something like that and you just want a couple extra shots, but you don't really want it, 10 frames per second or whatever. So that's what that does. I'm just going to put it back to, here, self-timer, just so you can see what self-timer does here. I'll put it on 2 seconds. Right there, that's 2 second self-timer. That's what it does. And also note, guys, when you do self-timer, the focus is locked when you start this process. So the focus is locked. If you put something in front, it's not going to change in self-timer mode, just so you know. All right, so if we go to function, and now we change the focus mode. Let's check out AFA. And also note, guys, you see how AFC is grayed out right now? I can't use autofocus continuous, and you know why? Because I have self-timer set. So I just wanted to show you that quick. Let's go back to single shot. And now if I go into function AFA, you see how AFC is now available? You can see by default it's focusing on George Washington's face up there because I have facial recognition turned on. it's not focusing on the quarter or this metal here, which is closer to the camera than this face is. So it's still picking the face. So watch this. Watch when I turn off subject. So I'm just going to turn this off. And now watch what happens. There it goes. So it just changed to the quarter. All you do is just press the shutter button over and over, and the camera will like go around the scene, and eventually it'll find what it's looking for usually. However, I could have just overrode this by touching. So I could have just touched on the quarter, and now it's only going to limit the focus to that area. And you can see the little cancel switch button right there. To cancel that, you could just tap that. Or you can hit this center button to cancel it, and that'll get rid of it, as you see there. So like I was saying, the camera by default is going to focus on what's closest to it, and it's sensing this right here is a little bit closer than the quarter. Now if I swing the quarter out a little bit like that, it should switch to the quarter, and it does, as you can see. So let me just show you the DMF mode here. And this is a perfect example because it's not focusing on the quarter, which is actually what I want. So check this out. If I go into function, I'm just going to leave the facial off for now. And I'm going to change the focus mode to direct manual focus here. All right, I'll show you AFC in a second. So direct manual, this is how it works. So watch, I'm going to lock the shutter. And now I can fine tune the focus. See how it's moving around? So let me move up to the quarter. And I can fine tune it to get the quarter sharp, like that, and then take the photo. So that's how direct manual focus works. Like when you have it locked, you can override it by manipulating this. And then when you take the photo, it'll take it wherever the focus is. That's what direct manual does. Pretty cool feature. Now, if I switch this to autofocus continuous, when I focus, you'll see those little dots come up. Now watch when I hold the shutter button down and I move the door a little bit. You see how it's like looks like the dancing ants like I told you earlier? That's continuous autofocus. Now it won't do that in autofocus single. If I switch it back to autofocus single and I lock the focus, see how it's locked? Now watch. You see how it's not changing? That's the key difference. Now what's cool about AFS is it allows you to focus on something and then reframe the shot. So I can focus and then move the camera and the focus won't change. So it's very helpful if you're trying to like focus on a flower or something, for example, and then you want to move the camera to get like some background element in there. This is a good way to do it. Now again, if I turn this priority back on, notice how it's going to focus on George Washington's face again. So it's ignoring what's in front of the camera here and picking the face. It's overriding. Very, very cool how that works. And this will work depending on what subject you have detected. So if I select like bird, for example, the camera's ignoring the face now and it's just focusing on what it thinks it needs to focus on. I'm very surprised it's not picking the quarter, to be honest with you. Usually I would expect it to do that. But you can just touch around and it'll override it, no problem. Alright guys, so one other thing I wanted to show you here is when you go into recognition target in photography mode, you notice how there's that arrow there to the right. I forgot to cover that at the desk a minute ago, sorry. But if you hit the right here, this is where you actually have a tracking shift range. And you can dial that in to narrow or wide. So even more power as far as how much the tracking will shift. So that's pretty darn cool if you ask me. And then in here you have another arrow, and this is where you can set priority. So you can set the priority on animals or birds even though both are selected. And then you have recognition part. I mean, this is absolutely incredible, all this power. And you know, just a couple more detailed settings here. Standard, look at this. Sensitivity. Incredible amount of power available in this mode. So just wanted to add to that because I forgot to mention that. Just going to put that back to human, like so. Alright, so let me just go into manual focus here. And again, I really like DMF, but sometimes you just need manual focus. So now I'm in manual focus, and if I just turn the focus, it's automatically going to zoom in to 100%. Now you can move this around, like so. You can put it on the quarter, for example, like so, and there you have it. and then you're able to take the photo. Now if you press the center button again, it'll zoom in even more, and then it'll zoom out and zoom in like so. And right now it's because I have the timer set to unlimited, it's not going to go away. So if I take the photo, or if I press the shutter, it will go away. And now it'll take the photo. So that's how manual focus works. Now, another tool for manual focus, if you go in here for focus assist, you have focus magnifier, which is what I just showed you, but you have peaking display. Now if I turn this on, and let me just change the color to like blue so it's a little easier to see. Alright, there you go. That's pretty cool, right? You can actually see the blue on the quarter. So now if you turn, because I'm in manual focus, you can't see the peaking when it's zoomed in like that, but when it's not magnified, you can see it. So that's what peaking does. It's pretty handy, and like I said, if you go in the menu and turn off focus magnifier, it will stay on. So if I turn this off, now focus magnifier is now off. So when I turn the focus ring, you see how it's not zooming automatically, like it's not magnifying, but now you can see the peaking. So now I know the dollar pretty much is sharp, and if you go all the way to the background, now you can see the background lights are sharp. Come all the way back till you see the blue on the quarter, right about there. That's what peaking does. And again, you can change the color and the amount of it. So let me just turn focus magnifier back on, because I actually prefer focus magnifier over peaking. But again, this is where you can change peaking, and then you have high, medium, low, and of course the color. I'm just going to turn that off. I'm in manual focus mode. And again, AFA, this will actually just be a combination. So if the subject is moving, it'll detect it. So watch, I have it locked. You see how it's detecting it automatically? That's what AFA does. So by default, it's just going to lock on the focus, and it shouldn't change. Like you can see, it's not changing. But if you start moving a lot in the scene, it'll recognize movement, and it will switch to AFC mode. That's what AFA does, and it works really well. If you're, just want the camera to automatically decide what you're doing, that's a good way to go. In general, I tend to leave it on AFA these days, or I just dial it into exactly what I need. Alright guys, let's switch this into video, and I will show you how this stuff changes a little bit. So, let me hit the display button to get rid of the auto leveler. Go to function, and now you have autofocus continuous, and you have autofocus manual. So it's just manual or autofocus continuous. Those are your options. Now, again, by default, the camera is going to focus on what it sees in the scene, and it sees the face, so it's focusing on that face by default. So if I turn off facial, like so, in theory, it should focus on the quarter. I'm just pressing the shutter button halfway down, and notice how it did switch to the quarter. So that's pretty much how it works. Now, if I hit record, it's actually going to focus and track the quarter, or whatever's closest to the camera. By default, it's just going to autofocus continuous. Now, if I touch the dollar bill, the focus will transition to the dollar bill. And if I focus back on the quarter, it'll focus back to the quarter. If I click on the background, it'll go to the background, and so forth. Now, the time it takes for it to go to the background to the foreground is that focus transition speed. And then, of course, you have the focus shift sensitivity, which will determine how quickly the autofocus will switch from one subject to another if you're not touching anything. So if it's just like the whole scene, like if a human comes in, it'll switch to that human really quick, depending on how you have that set. So let me just stop recording. And again, guys, you have focus area you can change in this mode as well. So I have it set to wide area, so it's using the whole screen. So you can still change the focus area to different sizes and stuff. So if I go into function here, and let me select tracking. And now let me just touch the quarter. All right, so now the subject is on the quarter, and it is tracking the quarter. So it will track it now. So if I move the camera, it's going to track the quarter, and it'll also track it if I move the quarter. So that's how tracking works, and it's a little bit different than touch to focus. So I could go over here, and it's going to find something to track, and it's acting like touch to focus, but it is tracking, so it's not just focus. And there it is back to the quarter. I'll just stop recording. So that's how that works. Now, if we go into the menu here, we have the peaking options and stuff like that, but I just wanted to show you a couple other things here really quick. So right here, this is where the autofocus transition speed is. So if I slow this down to like 2 and now hit record, if I select the background, it's going to take longer to get there. You see how much slower it is? So it looks a little more cinematic, you know what I mean? That's pretty much it. That's how it works. Pretty darn cool, right? So that's what focus transition speed does. And like I said, I usually leave it around 4 or 5. And then the sensitivity we already went over. Now AF assist, I have that on. So check this out. If I hit record, and now I just turn the focus ring, I'm just switching to like the dollar bill, like right about there. So the focus just now switched to the dollar bill, and now it's doing that. And I'm doing that while recording. So I can switch to the background like so, and now the camera is focused on the background. So you can do that with the focus ring, which is, again, very powerful, in particular when you're really close to subjects. So, you know, like a quarter, if I had another quarter right behind that one and I wanted to switch between the two, this is a really cool mode for that purpose. And that's pretty much how that works. So I have that on by default. You can turn it on or off depending on what you're up to. Alright, this stuff is pretty much all the same as photo here. Subject recognition, turn that back on. Actually, I'm going to leave that off because it keeps picking George Washington's face. Face memory and stuff. Focus map. Now this is what I want to show you. Focus map. Alright, so now you can see when I change the focus how the colors are changing. So when you see clear, like right there on the quarter, you see how the quarter is looking clear? That's how you know the autofocus is on the quarter. So let's switch to the dollar bill right there. So now the dollar bill is in focus. You can see right there, dollar bill. Now it's switching. Where's the dollar bill? There's the quarter. So that's focus map. Now it's just another tool. It's kind of similar to peaking. So menu, I don't really ever use it though, to be honest. Turn that off. Got focus magnifier. Alright guys, that about wraps up this video on autofocus with the Sony A6700. Now, this will also apply to the newer cameras as they come out. The Sony A6700 is like the latest and greatest, but the Sony ZV-E1 is very similar to the A6700 as far as all these different options go, just so you guys are aware. So in any event, I really hope you got something out of this video. If you did, if you can give me a thumbs up, I'd really appreciate it. And it'd be really cool if you subscribe. All right, guys, I'll catch up with you next time. Take care.